Tourism's Facebook page. Before we begin, a few housekeeping notes. Please ensure that you've signed in at the entrance so that we can provide you with any additional information that may be necessary for you later on. There are some refreshments that are available at the back of the room. Please help yourselves throughout. Restrooms, if you're not familiar with the space, are located to my right. In this corner is the mail room. In the middle, it's wheelchair accessibility, or if you need to use it, you can use it if one of the other two are occupied. And at the back right is the female restroom. If you haven't done so already, I'll ask you to please put your phones on silent for us. And as is customary at these meetings, we'll begin with tonight's proceedings with a prayer. I'd like to invite the Honorable Minister for Tourism and Ports to bring us the prayer.
Thank you, Donna. Good evening, everyone. Let us bow our heads. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for the opportunity for us to be here tonight, bringing us here safe, allowing us to have these opportunities of discussion in a free democratic society. We know that many people across the earth don't have that luxury and that privilege and that right. So we thank you for that opportunity. We ask that you bless all of our thoughts, our minds, and those who are been selected to guide this country through a very significant infrastructure direction for this country. May you bless us to find the right path that will allow us to be successful as we've done over the many decades of this Cayman Islands. May our conclusions be in the best interest of everyone in our beloved borders of the Cayman Islands. We ask you all these things in your Son Jesus Christ's name. Amen.
Thank you very much, Minister. My name is Donna Bush, by the way, and I'm your MC for the evening. It's my pleasure to be here with you. So, ladies and gentlemen, tonight's meeting is being held to provide you with information on the cargo port project and, of course, to discuss the potential options with you, members of the public. Your feedback is an important aspect in the development of the outlined business case and the master plan, and we greatly appreciate you sharing your thoughts with us throughout this evening and throughout this process. This meeting also provides an opportunity for you to have your questions about the project answered, and we look forward, of course, to doing so later on this evening in just a bit. I'd like to now acknowledge the special guests that are in attendance this evening, and of course, I'll introduce our panelists. As you hear your name called, please raise your hand for me. We're honored to have, we just introduced the Honorable Kenneth Bryan, Minister for Tourism and Ports, as well as Mr. Klein Glidden. He's the chairman of the Cayman Islands Ports Authority. On the panel this evening, we'll have Mr. Strand Bodden. He's the chairman of the steering committee. Mr. Paul Hurlston, he's the director of the Port Authority. Mr. Harold Westerman, he's the sector lead for Ports and Marine Terminal, Stantic. And Mr. Sam Story, he's the associate partner and advisory for KPMG. Mr. Simon Griffiths, he is the PWD project manager for the Cargo Port Development Project. And last but certainly not least, Ms. Christine Adnett. She's a technical director for Royal Housekeeping. All right, well, the program this evening will start with opening remarks from our Honorable Minister, during which time he will provide us with a brief overview of the Cargo Port Project. Please give him a round of applause. Following the Minister's remarks, there'll be a presentation from Mr. Harold Westerman, followed by Q&A segment where you'll be invited to ask your questions. We're going to have, of course, there is a microphone in the middle of the room that will be there for those of you who want to come up and ask your questions. For our virtual attendees or persons who prefer not to come to the mic, there is another option. That one is anonymous. It's called Slido.com. Now, you'll see the QR codes are on the walls around you. If you don't want to do that, There's another option. Just go to Slido, slido.com, and put in the code that is 4690030. I'll be giving out that code throughout this evening. Again, that code is 4690030. The code is on the wall for you. So just send in your questions or your comments anonymously, and of course, we'll address those here for you. Now we'd like to call on the minister for his remarks.
Thank you again, Donna, so much for being the MC for tonight's remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It is truly my pleasure to welcome you to this public consultation meeting on the cargo port redevelopment and expansion for the Cayman Islands. Thank you for taking your time out to join us here. I know that many of you have your family responsibilities to take care of after work. So I really appreciate you taking the time away from your family as we take discussions here at this public meeting about a very important piece of infrastructure for the future. As the Minister for Tourism and Ports, I am honored to open this important discussion on a project that is being spearheaded, as you heard, by the Port Authority of the Cayman Islands, better known as PACI. The primary goal of tonight's meeting is to hear from you, the good people of this country. You may have heard about the cargo port redevelopment project, but what does it mean? And what does it entail? And how did we get here to this point in this process? In 2022, the Port Authority developed a strategic outline case, which is commonly referred to as a SOC, that highlighted their concerns regarding the operations of the cargo port facility and its ability to efficiently continue its operations for the future. Their concerns were that the port facility is getting old, and the infrastructure, in terms of infrastructure, it is nearing the end of its functional lifespan. As our economy expands and more goods are imported, the port is becoming increasingly stretched. Projections indicate that within the next decade, the current port infrastructure will be unable to handle the anticipated increase in cargo volumes, which are necessary to support our growing economy. The cargo port shares a space with the cruise operations, forcing it into a two-part shift system. Again, as the volumes of import increases, this arrangement will become unsustainable. The strategic outline case developed by the Port Authority listed a number of potential options and was presented to Cabinet for government's consideration earlier last year. Cabinet reviewed and accepted the strategic outline case and gave its approval for an outline business case, or OBC, to be conducted. I know that there's differences between the strategic outline case and the outline business case may not always be clear, so in layman terms, I will explain. The strategic outline case is basically a list of potential options to consider, and the outline business case, or better known as the OBC, is a more detailed report that takes a deeper dive into the list of options and evaluations of the pros and the cons and the cost of each option with the proper professionals involved that are independent of the government. After a robust open procurement process, as required by the law, a group consisting of consultants from Stantec, KPMG, and forgive me if I ruined the name of this company, Royal Hasco Ning. Yes, got it right, good. Who are here with us tonight, as you heard from our MC. They were contracted by the Port Authority to develop the outline business case. The business case is nearing its final stages of information gathering, and it is vital to hear the views of the public, who are also included for consideration to guide the government in its final report before it's presented to Cabinet. As this is why the consultation meeting is being held here tonight, to provide you with the opportunity to express your opinions, provide your feedback, and ask the questions that you may have. As I said in my start of my remarks, the consultants from Stantec, KPMG, and Royal Housekeeping are here to share the information about the project. But equally, they're here to listen and incorporate your feedback from the public into the OBC report. So I encourage everyone here tonight and those who are listening at home to participate actively in the discussion. No question is a silly question, as your feedback will play a crucial role in shaping the option that the business case will ultimately recommend to Cabinet for its approval. I'm going to say that again because this is why tonight is so important. Your feedback is crucial to shaping the option that the business case would ultimately recommend to Cabinet for approval. I recognize that we're on a timeline, so I'll end there by acknowledging and expressing my many thanks to the consultants who are here diligently working to identify the pros and cons and the potential options for us to choose from. Their research and their analysis will provide the government and this country with the reliable information we need to make informed decisions. We'll also note that my representative from the ministry, the Honorable Chief Officer Strand Borden, and the director of the port, he doesn't like it when I call him honorable, but he's an honorable man, so I do that all the time. And the director from the Port Authority, Mr. Paul Hurlston, and of course my chairman of the board, Mr. Klein Glidden. And I think some of our other board members are here I want to recognize. Please take the opportunity to stand up, board members, please. Those who are in the room. Thank you. I am certain that the other ones are currently on their way. Mr. Hurlston will also help to add context to this discussion tonight with his expertise in the port operations. This is an independent exercise, so I'm not here as a minister, and I will not be participating on the panel because these consultants will be advising me as minister for me to take it back to Cabinet on your behalf, the good people of this country. So I'm merely here to support the consultation process, which is the most important process of this decision-making journey. With that being said, I want to thank you once again and look forward to hearing your thoughts, your questions, because we take them seriously. For those who are online, again, go to Slido, please, because I know that many of us may not be mobile to get here tonight. Those who are on Facebook, please send your comments in and take the time to go to the Ministry of Tourism and Ports website to do the survey. The survey closes on Friday, and we want to hear from the people. And I thank those who are here in audience tonight to take the time to be with us. I look forward to the discussion and the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Bryan, for those insightful words which I feel have aptly set the stage for tonight's discussions. Now we'll hear from Mr. Westerman, Harold Westerman. He's the project lead consultant from Stantec. He will be presenting the detailed outline of the project for us this evening.
Good evening. Can you hear me? Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming out this evening. I believe we're going to be doing the questions at the end of the presentation, and I want to apologize. It's not the shortest presentation, so settle in. We have a lot. It's a complex project, and we have a lot of information to cover this evening. So the topics that we're going to be covering this evening, and that's the agenda, we're going to talk about the objective of the outline business case, and the minister already sort of touched upon that. We're going to talk about the existing port and the supporting cargo distribution center. We're going to talk about the long and short list of potential options and sites for a new port. Most of those sites were included in the strategic outline case, but there are some additional sites that have been added. We're going to talk about planning horizons. How far out do we plan for? That's a very important consideration when you're developing plans for a new port. Are you planning for the next 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years? And we're going to talk about that. From that, we're going to be talking about projections of population and GDP going out for the duration of that planning horizon. And the reason that's important is because that leads into development of what are the expected volumes of cargo that the port can be expected to handle at the planning horizon. And the two really go hand in hand, and you'll see how. We're also going to talk, then we're going to show you the actual cargo forecasts, and as well as vessel size forecasts. So another important consideration when you're designing a port is what size of vessels that the port would need to accommodate. At that point, we're going to get to the good stuff, and that's showing you the plans, concept plans of the shortlisted options for a new or expanded port. Then we're going to talk about those options, and we're going to have Ms. Annette talk about environmental appraisals of the options. We're going to talk about transportation assessments. As you're probably aware, there's a lot of traffic that goes to and from ports, particularly trucks picking up and dropping off goods. So we want to be able to ensure the transportation network can handle that traffic. So we'll talk briefly about that. We're going to talk about the comparison of costs amongst those shortlisted options. And then we're going to talk about and you'll see why, we're going to talk about a short-term upgrade to the existing port and the CDC. And then we'll have a few closing remarks, and then we really want to turn it over, and this is really the heart of why we're here. We want to turn it over to you to ask your questions and provide your comments on what you've seen tonight. So I think we were touched upon, this was the consultant team that began work on the OBC late last year. I represent the firm of Stantec. Stantec is a Canadian-based company of architects, engineers, and environmental scientists. We have over 30,000 staff worldwide in 400 offices, and we're currently a top 10 ranked designer of marine and port facilities. I myself, I lead our port division. I've been planning and designing ports for 37 years, and I've been working in the West Indies and the Caribbean region for over 30 years. And we currently have projects ongoing in the Bahamas, Montserrat, St. Vincent, and here. Our partners are KPMG. I think most of you have probably heard of KPMG. I know they've got a building with a big sign on the side of it, so you should see that. They are UK headquartered, one of the big four accounting and financial services firms in the world with 265,000 staff in 145 locations, and they have a very big presence in the Cayman Islands with about 400 staff. Royal Haskoning, DHV, is a Dutch-based global engineering company and environmental consultancy, and they have about 6,000 staff, and they're also a well-recognized global port consultant. And we also have, which wasn't mentioned earlier, BCQS. That's a local firm from the Cayman Islands that specializes in real estate and cost estimation services, and they have about 100 staff in 13 locations across the Caribbean. So the objective of the OBC, it's really very simple. It's to really select a preferred location for a new or expanded port. And that's primarily what we're doing. Where are we going to either expand the existing port or build a new port, and what is the preferred location? That preferred location has not been selected. You'll see options for potential locations, but we really want to hear from you before a decision is made of what is the preferred location. And by doing that, we'll develop a concept layout. We're nowhere near the final design. What you're going to see tonight are just concepts of the ports at various locations. They're not in stone by any means. There'll be a lots more design development that would have to occur over the subsequent years. So the existing Georgetown port. I think a lot of you know that we have cargo and cruise operations currently working at the same location, which creates a lot of conflicts. Primarily, the cargo is handled at night, and the cargo has to be moved off the port so that cruise operations can take over during the day. That's because of space limitations at the existing port, and there's also a lot of traffic congestions, particularly when the cruise is in. So the existing Georgetown port and the cargo distribution center is basically at or near its capacity. resulting in already significant delays in offloading vessels and handling cargo, the double handling of cargo, which means quite often the cargo has to come off the ships, and instead of picking up your goods at the port, that cargo has to be moved inland to the CDC. So that's called double handling the cargo, and as well as demurrage of vessels, because of a lack of capacity, many vessels have to wait offshore before they can be offloaded, and that incurs demurrage costs. That really what that all means if you've got unhappy users of the port, as well as increased costs to consumers. Given the space limitations, everyone that we spoke to, and we had extensive consultations with numerous stakeholders, everyone agreed that the Port Authority is doing a very good job with what they have. They're still facing a lot of challenges, primarily because of the situation that we described in the first point. Even if crews, and we get this question a lot, even if crews were to relocate and the port expanded at its existing location, the port would still be constrained in by an urban environment, which is Georgetown, and likely restricted to nighttime cargo, so you don't have a lot of trucks moving through Georgetown during the day. As a result of that, a new port in a new location outside of Georgetown should be considered, and that's some of the options that you're going to see today. So we started off with a long list of potential sites. 1 and 2 is the existing port in the CDC, and then we've got 10 additional sites. All of these were 4, 6, 8, 9, 10, and 12 were in the SOC. 3 and 7 were added at a later time, along with 11, and 5 actually came from one of the stakeholders that we talked about. So 3, there's a long matrix of pros and cons of each, and we would be here for a very long time if we went through that. But I'll quickly go through each one and make the, well, not make the case, but give you the reasons why we've only carried 4 of those locations forward for analysis and conceptual design. So 3, starting with 3, there's a fairly large piece of undeveloped land up in West Bay, and ports require land, so we looked at that piece of land as a potential location for a new port. It obviously would require alteration to North Sound for access for the ships. 4 comes out of the strategic outline case, and it proposed an artificial island in North Sound for building a port, and that island would be connected back to West Bay by a causeway. 5, the rationale for 5 was much of the goods that come into the island, they're distributed, and the warehousing in the industrial zone around the airport is where they initially go. So having a port close by to where the goods are being destined to, initially at least, warehouses, would be a good thing, because it would reduce trucking distance. But obviously, it would require a substantial channel to get access to that location for vessels. So we decided to go ahead with number 3. There's obviously social and environmental implications, which we'll talk about for 3, 4, and 5 that are quite serious. But it was determined that 4 and 5 would have the most consequential impacts, and therefore, if 3, for lack of a better word, doesn't pass muster from an environmental and social perspective, 4 and 5 certainly wouldn't. So we've carried 3 forward, and also it was a nice option because it would use existing land. 6 is in South Sound. We eliminated that option primarily because it would be a new port built on reclaimed land, basically building like a small island, again, on the shallows of South Sound, but you would be blocking all those residential homes that are along the waterfront there. So you're in the midst of a residential community, and it was kind of thought, well, that's not a very good thing to be blocking people's houses. So, and all of a sudden putting a large industrial facility like a port in a residential community. So that option was eliminated. 7, that was originally brought up because there's a fairly significant piece of undeveloped land that's next to the proposed Le Méridien. But it was then when we looked at that land and we looked at the topography and the bathymetry, it really wasn't a suitable location for a port for a variety of technical reasons. So that one was eliminated. 8 9, and 10, we've carried those all forward. They all are seen as technically viable sites. They were seen as, although quite a distance, trucking distance away from the industrial zone, it was still what we heard was an acceptable distance, but on the contingent upon the east-west arterial road going ahead. 11 was eliminated for 2 reasons. It was seen as too far for trucking from the industrial zone, and like 7, the actual topography and the bathymetry of the land, this is right next door to Health City, was not seen as suitable for constructing a port. And then 12 was eliminated for similar reasons as 11 and 6. You'd be building a new port on reclaimed land in front of a residential area. There are homes along the waterfront there. And the trucking distance, if you have a warehouse, in the industrial zone next to Georgetown and sending a truck all the way across the island to pick up your goods and all the way back, it was just seen as too far. So as a result, you're going to see concept plans today for options for site 3, 8, 9, and 10. The rest were dropped and not shortlisted. So the planning horizons. So generally, when you develop a new port or a major expansion of an existing port, it's generally a 10 to 15 year process. That's how long it generally takes by the time you go through your business case analysis and your preliminary design and your environmental impact assessments and your procurement and then construction. 10 to 15 years is not unusual around the world. I'm actually working on a project right now which I started 23 years ago. So it takes that long to develop facilities like this. As a result, for the long-term planning horizon, we adopted the year of 2084, which is essentially allowing 10 to 15 years before that port opens. And then once it opens, you want to make sure what you just built is going to have enough capacity for a long duration. You just finished going through a major exercise of building this port. You want to make sure it can accommodate the cargo and the growth of cargo for quite some time. And quite often what's adopted is around 45 to 50 years. So if we put the duration to implement the port, plus we want to allow a long duration of capacity in the port, that gives us about a 60-year planning horizon, and hence the 2084 is what we've planned for. And you'll see in a couple of slides why that is so important. The short term, and you're going to see some short-term plans as well, is, well, what do we do in the next 10 to 15 years? I mean, the port now, as I said earlier, is at or near capacity, so we need to do something in the short term until that new facility can open. So we're going to talk about that tonight as well. We also, in the outlined business case, we're also required to look at a 100-year horizon. And what we've done there is we didn't develop plans, but we want to make sure that the plans and the location that's selected for the new port has land around it and has the ability to expand. So 60 years from now, the people who are sitting in this room and the people who are working in the government and such, and that the Port Authority aren't facing the issue that's being faced today. I mean, the existing port was built around 50 years ago, and here we are. So, and there's no land around it. So we want to make sure that the people that are in that situation 60 years from now, they have the ability to expand that port even further. So, cargo projections for those 2 years. Cargo growth is generally, not always, but generally it corresponds to population and GDP growth. So most of the cargo that's coming in is containerized cargo and break bulk. It's consumer goods that are coming in. It's things in your home, the things you go grocery shopping, food, items, your clothing, all those sorts of things for your home. So it really follows population, but it also follows GDP. So particularly when we're designing ports in a developing nation that's getting wealthier, quickly advancing, because as the population grows, and if that population is getting richer, they have a tendency to buy more stuff, and therefore the port has to accommodate that as well. So we had to look for we don't develop internally the population projections for the island. So we had to look for sources of what is the expected population in the future. Oh, that's going to help. Thank you. For the island. So the Economics and Statistics Office, they only publish short-term population projections. In this case, they only produce a population projection for 2026. So we were talking to them, earlier this year. So really only about 2 or 3 years. And obviously we're looking 60 years out. So that wasn't enough. The airport OBC undertook a population. They hired a consultant and they did a population projection for the airport, because again, you want to plan your airport expansion for growth well into the future. And they did a population projection to 2041. The National Roads Authority did not develop a population, but they did hold a design charrette, a gathering of a number of people like you see in this room, and say, what do we think the population is going to be in 2074? And they produced a number of scenarios for that. So they just listened to a bunch of, a group of people and what their thoughts are for population growth of Grand Cayman. So the airport projections and the NRI projections, which you can see on these lower lines, I don't know if, no, this is not going to work. Okay, so you'll see these blue and gray lines down here. They were showing growth in the near term of only about 1% a year, compounded annual growth in population. And we looked at the last 10 years. In the last 10 years, the annual compounded growth of Grand Cayman has been 4%. So the island's been growing. I think you're probably all aware of that. It's been growing very rapidly. So we considered that going from a 4% to all of a sudden a 1% growth was too low. Another thing that came out of the work that the NRA did was they said by 2074 in the high case projection that the population of Grand Cayman would max out at about 250,000 people. I'm just going to grab some more. And that was considered as the high case for the island. So the projection that was adopted for the OBC case was a 2%. So from 2026, from that ESO projection, population growing at 2% compounded annual growth. So it's half of what we've seen the last 10 years, growing to 250,000 and then plateauing. So it's this green line that you see there. That was the adopted case. Now, bear in mind, there's no wrong or right answer to this because you're looking 60 years into the future. So it really is, it is truly an estimate based on the available information that you have. So there's no such thing as a wrong or right answer of what the population is going to be. And this was not influenced by any government policy at this point. So there was no input from the government on this. This was just looking at what others had done because we really needed to adopt a population forecast in order to generate cargo forecasts, which you'll see coming up. So the GDP forecast, basically what we said is already Grand Cayman's a fairly advanced, a wealthy place. So we said that the GDP per capita would be maintained throughout that 60-year life. So basically, the GDP numbers would follow in line with population. It wouldn't be like a real developing country that is becoming much more wealthier, and hence people are buying a lot more stuff. It already is a fairly wealthy country, so GDP per capita is fairly flat. And that and you'll see the graph essentially looks like the population graph. So the next slide you're going to see after this is the actual projected volumes of cargo, and that's really what we're trying to get to, because on that basis we can then say, well, how big does the port, or what does the port need to look like to accommodate that volume of cargo? So these are the cargoes that are currently handled not only at the public port, but also at some private facilities, but it is considered port cargo because they do collect that information and they do collect wharfage on it. So containers, hopefully everyone is familiar with containers. Most of your goods come in a steel box. That's how most of our goods around the world move these days, in a steel box. So the container forecasts are primarily based on the GDP forecast, which is in line with population. Plus, we added on to that LNG, liquefied natural gas. CUC, Caribbean Utility Company, is in the process in the short term of converting. Right now, your electricity generation is from diesel generators. They burn a lot of diesel. And they want to convert over to a transitional fuel, which is liquefied natural gas. It's still a fossil fuel, but it burns a lot cleaner than diesel, and eventually go to renewables. So there is an uptick, and that LNG would be imported in ISO containers, basically tanks that are around the same size as a container. That's how they intend to bring in the LNG. So we would have to add those volumes. The break bulk is any sort of loose cargo. It can be stuff on pallets, it could be steel pipe, all kinds of stuff is break bulk cargo. Anything that's really not containerized primarily is, unless it's a liquid or a dry, what we call a dry bulk like sand or aggregate, is break bulk. Volumes are pretty small, but we expect that, again, to follow the national GDP. And already the vast majority of cargo is containerized. So we don't see what we call the containerization rate. We don't see more things being containerized because most stuff is already containerized that are coming into the island. Autos come in containers. Some come in containers. A lot of them just come in what we call roll on, roll off. They literally just drive the car off the ship. That generally follows the population growth. Population grows, more people are going to buy cars. And so it looks at population and national GDP. Cement and aggregate. So the aggregate, I'm going to jump just really quickly. The aggregate that comes into the island is strictly, it's rock and sand that's used for concrete production, which is then in turn used for construction. And along with cement, you produce concrete. So the cement and the aggregate forecast was based on construction GDP growth, so how much construction is going on in the island. And I'll talk a little bit about construction fill later. Then we have, at the liquid bulk facility south of Georgetown, we have gasoline, we have diesel, we have jet fuel and LPG that are brought in through Sol, Rubis, and Home Gas. So gasoline generally is used by autos, and it kind of follows along with the auto forecast, which is population. Diesel, most of the diesel is used by CUC. So obviously it's going to grow with population, but then we have to take into account this transitioning to LNG. They still have to bring in some diesel to prime the engines, but looking at the adoption of renewables into the future. So that one's a little more complicated. And jet fuel and LPG primarily follows the tourist trade. Jet fuel is obviously for the planes, bringing in the tourists. And the LPG, most of the LPG on the island is used by hotels. The laundry facilities use a lot of LPG, as well as the restaurants. So the majority of the LPG, yes, there is stuff for residential use, but a lot of it is used by the hotel and the tourist industry. So we kind of look at the growth of the tourist industry and the GDP there. So on this basis, we've come up with our cargo forecast. So what you see in the left-hand column are those cargo products. And we see along the top each, oh, there we go. But bring me back my water, please. I'm just going to put this here. And then what you'll see is the existing cargo numbers. So we actually put in 2013, so how much cargo we were handling 10 years ago and what the port handled last year. So you can see there's some pretty significant growth there. And then 2039, 59, and most importantly, 2084 in red, and then 100 years out. So those would be the projected growth in those cargoes. So for example, containers last year was 37,000. By 2084, that's expected to almost triple in volume. Autos would go up almost fourfold. Break bulk's not a big volume. 7,500 tons is not a lot, but still, it's still going to expected to grow quite significantly. Cement and aggregate. So cement is expected to triple. the volume of cement that's brought in, 58,000 tons up to 157,000 tons. And aggregate, and this is the one that's a little bit quirky, and I'll get to why, is last year we handled about 357,000 tons of rock and sand for concrete production. But what we heard from a lot of people, if the port had capacity, we would import construction fill. So right now, the general fill that you use for construction for building roads and developing sites and raising sites and just general, overall fill comes from the quarries at breakers. There is an aggregate report that says in the future that's expected to move over to importing fill. The quarries are going to reach their capacity at some point, and therefore it'll be the ability to produce construction fill on the island will be limited. And even to this day, we heard from the importers that they would import fill if the port could handle the volume. And right now, the port just does not have the ability to handle that volume of cargo. So that's why in 2039, you see two numbers. The first number would be just before the new port opens. So the existing port has to continue handling up to 540,000 tons of rock and sand for concrete production. But when the new port opens, then the port would have capacity to bring in construction fill, and we expect that number to jump and then continue to grow. So between 2023 and 2084, we do anticipate a significant increase in the amount of rock, sand, and construction fill coming into the port. Diesel, 30, you can see it's been pretty flat for the last 10 years. It's not expected to go up a lot. And really, what's that reflecting? It's reflecting CUC transitioning to LNG and eventually to renewables. So there's seen as very little growth in the import of diesel. Gasoline would go up, but we're expecting to see more and more electric vehicles. So we don't see, although it was based on population, we don't expect to see a tripling of gasoline use because we're going to see a greater and greater adoption of electric vehicles, which would then obviously mean less gasoline. So not a big jump in volume there. Jet fuel would continue to increase with tourist visits, and LPG would also continue to increase with tourist visits. So the red volumes are that's the planning horizon. That's the volumes of cargo that are expected based on primarily that population growth that we should plan for the port to handle in 2084. Vessels. We heard, globally, ships have been getting bigger. My first port design in the mid, 30 years ago, the biggest container ship in the world was 4,000 TEU. A TEU is one 20-foot container. So a 40-foot container is 2 TEUs. So the biggest container ship in the world in 1993, when I was designing that facility, was 4,000 TEUs. The biggest ship today is 24,000 TEUs. Gives you an illustration of just how much the ship sizes have grown. But those are on the big transatlantic, these are big ships that are going from Shanghai to Los Angeles, and Rotterdam, and those sorts of things. What we heard consistently here, obviously the ships that come into Grand Cayman are much smaller than that. But what we heard consistently from the shipping lines is that they don't expect to see a large increase in the size of vessels. Even if we built a port that could handle a huge ship, they wouldn't be bringing in huge ships into Grand Cayman. They won't be getting direct calls from Asia, for example, or from Europe. So what we did, the recommendation was that we would say the biggest ships that call today would be our average size ship, and the biggest ships in the future would be the same percentage size largest. So we're saying essentially in the future the largest ships are going to be about 10 or 20% bigger. And the shipping line said even if they build new ships, they're going to build ships that are just a little bit bigger than what they have today. And for the container, the maximum size ship now is 700 TEU, so a lot smaller than that 24,000 TEU ship. But the biggest would probably be a 1,000 TEU vessel. So not a big increase in vessel sizes. So with that, information, we can now move forward and develop concept plans at those sites that we talked about earlier. So the plans were developed to accommodate that cargo in 2084. Yes, the port would open in 15 years, but you want to make sure that the port has the ability to handle increases in cargo over time without having to build more and more and more. There will obviously be some phasing of that, but primarily the primary infrastructure should be there to handle that cargo volume as well as the size of vessels. Currently aggregates are delivered to the port, they're put into trucks, and they are taken away to their final user, or they don't go to the CDC. We heard from a number of the aggregate importers that they would continue to do that operation to avoid double handling of the aggregate. So the aggregate would be discharged, and then the trucks would head off the port to a private destination of the users. Gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and LPG. Those products are currently handled not at the public port. They're handled at Seoul, Rubis, and the LPG is handled at Home Gas. We had very good meetings with all three of them, and basically what we heard was their facilities are in very good condition. They put a lot of effort into maintenance as well as major upgrades. The Home Gas facility just was almost entirely rebuilt recently. So those facilities have a lot of years of life left in them, and they have more than enough capacity to handle those projected volumes in 2084. And if you recall, we're not anticipating large increases in volume through those facilities. And what we heard from Seoul and Rubis and Home Gas is we have no problem at our current facility of handling those volumes. So the plans that you'll see today do not accommodate a relocation or the import of those products. We anticipate that they would continue to be handled at their existing facilities. The number of berths. So one of the first things we do is, well, how many berths? And a berth is a spot for one ship. So how many ships can we accommodate at one time, or how many do we need to accommodate? So what we did is we looked at, based on the size of the ships and the volume, you can estimate roughly how many ship calls you need to do each year and how long it's going to take to offload each one of those ships. We wanted to have the port that the berth, the wharf essentially, would not be occupied for more than 65% of the time, an actual physically occupied. And that's a kind of a design rule of thumb, is with multiple berths, when you start getting what we call a berth occupancy level, beyond that is when you'll start to experience congestion. In other words, people will show up with their vessel, and there's a higher likelihood that they won't have a spot to go to, and they'll have to anchor offshore, which is not a desirable thing. It's nice to have a port where your customer, the shipping line, shows up and they can go to berth. So on that basis, we estimated that we need to be able to handle 3 ships at once in 2084 for those volumes of cargo. The length of the wharf, now we know we need to handle 3 ships, how long should that wharf be? And what we did is, there's ships come in all kinds of sizes. The ranges are all over the place. So there's there's probably a million different combinations that you could come up with. But basically what we said is, let's have the port that we can accommodate 1 average size container ship and 1 average size aggregate ship at the same time. Those are the 2 biggest volumes of cargoes, is container and aggregate. Plus, if there's 2 average size ships there, if the largest vessel, which is 600 feet, were to show up, it would also have a place to go. So on that basis, an average size container ship, an average size aggregate ship, and 1 largest ship, which of either, could all be accommodated at one time. And based on that, we would have a 1,650 foot long wharf. All the plans you'll see, you obviously need to be able to get your ship to the port. So you need a shipping channel. And when you get to the port, the ships need to be able to turn. They need to be able to turn and maneuver at the dock. So the ship channel width and that turning basin diameter are based on the largest vessel, which is the 600-foot ship, based on that ship and the design guidelines from the World Association of Waterport Transportation Infrastructure, which is an organization It's primarily members are port engineers such as myself, and we develop, I sat on some of those committees, we develop design guidelines, there's probably about 200 of them, for designing and laying out ports. And those publications are peer-reviewed by experts in the industry, and they're very widely used. And this is just for a conceptual level. When we would go into detailed design, there would be another level of design for those, basically doing computer and full mission bridge simulations. But for now, we're using those design guidelines. All right, so now to the good stuff. That was all the preliminary stuff. So that lays the groundwork for what we're going to see now. So what we're looking at here, this is a typical layout regardless of location. So what we see, and I wish the pointer worked, but basically on the right-hand side, you'll see a big circle. That's the turning basin for the ship. So when a ship arrives in the shipping channel, it's a 2.5, that circle is 2.5 times the length of the longest ship. So 600 feet would be 1,500 feet, or yeah, 1,500 feet. So that is a space that's recommended primarily for ships that, if you have ships coming in that don't have tug assist, they don't have ASI pods or a lot of bow thrusters. You know, if you guys look at a cruise ship, for example, a cruise ship only needs a turning circle about 1.2 times its length because they have very sophisticated digital GPS systems and ASI. They can literally turn on a dime, but not all ships are like that. So you need a fairly big turning circle. Through that additional work in the future, we probably can bring that size down. But it also matches up quite nicely with the length of the wharf. So there you'll see in the middle of the drawing there, the three ships. The average container ship on the top, the average aggregate ship on the bottom, and then a larger ship, the largest ship in the middle berth. And that's 1,600 feet. So it kind of matches up, actually. That's just coincidence, by the way, that it matches up quite well with that turning circle. So that would be the ship basin and the wharf. Then you'll see the white rectangle. That's the actual port terminal on land, where we store containers, we store autos, we store cement, all those things, plus warehousing and offices and maintenance, and we'll go through it really quick. So for the 102,000 containers, 102,000 TUs of containers, those four blue lines, those would be the stacks for the containers, stacked 5 high. So each one of those little, I think you can see each one of those little squares is a 20-foot container. So you'd stack them in rows of 6 wide, 5 high, and that's the amount of, based on the average time that a container sits on the port before it's picked up, that's the amount of storage that we would require to handle that 102,000 TUs of containers. Below that, we're showing 3 acres of auto storage. So again, autos come off the ships, and they have to sit on the port for a certain duration of time before people come and pick up their cars. So based on the cargo projections, that's the amount of space that would be needed at the port. Behind it, we have the break bulk storage. That's that loose cargo that comes off the ships, 1.3 acres of storage. Below that is cement. Remember, cement's being imported. Currently, the cement comes off ships and it goes straight out, and it gets loaded into a truck and it goes away. We heard from the concrete producers that they would like to be able to store, they can offload the ship much faster if they could store the cement on the port. So it's stored in silos. So what you see there is, there's 8 little dots there. They look pretty small, but actually those are 9, I think they're 9-meter diameter silos. And now 8 of them would provide enough storage for the duration of time by the time a ship is offloaded and then the concrete producers come and pick up their cement. Then we require additional, so those are the 4 main storage areas. The LCL warehouse, so what that's for is about 20% of the containers, they are actually destuffed or emptied at the port because they're less than container tool. They'll take goods from this person and goods from that person and goods from that, and they'll consolidate them into one container. So the port has to then take those goods out, store them in a warehouse, and then people can come and pick up their goods. If you have goods coming that fills up an entire container, you're just going to come and pick up your container. But that's for the percentage of containers that that are consolidated goods. And we call it a less than container load, an LCL. So that's the size of the warehouse that's required for the volume. Below that is a maintenance building. There's a lot of big equipment on a port. It needs to be maintained, all kinds of equipment. So we need a maintenance facility with a parts room and big service bays, those sorts of things. An office, port administration office. Around that fenced area around it would be parking for the staff and the labor that's working at the port. And just below that would be what we call the truck gate. That's where trucks arrive at the port, and they stop, they talk to a clerk, they get processed, they say, I'm here to pick up this container or this piece of goods or whatever the case may be. They're processed, and then they go on to the port and they pick up their goods, and then they get checked. You know, we make sure they got the right thing before they leave, so they go out on an out gate. Substation, and then there's just additional space for equipment parking and miscellaneous cargo. They could probably store a little bit of aggregate on the port if need be, but basically that's just an initial. I mean, it's probably going to look a little bit. That's going to look different when we get through the full design, but generally that's the size of facility, which is 40 acres, which is about a little more than twice the size of the existing port and the CDC put together. So although our volumes were primarily tripling, we only need about double the area in the future. And then there would be a frontage road to get access to the port. There's 3 entrances into the port, and then that road would have to be connected to the adjacent road network, preferably a highway. So these general components or building blocks of the port, you're going to see each one of these at each of the 4 sites, and we're going to look at those now. Option 3. So if you recall, option 3 was up in West Bay on an available piece of land. And here you can see the green. This is undeveloped land at this point. So there we basically have plunked down that white rectangle of the terminal on land. Not in the water, it's on land. The wharf would be along the existing shoreline. We then, as I'm sure all of you know, North Sound is very shallow. It's only about 6 or 8 feet deep. But the ships need 37 and a half feet. The deepest vessel is, what is it now? It's about 33 feet, and then you'll need underkeel clearance. And this is to mean sea level, so that adds another 1.5 feet. So we need about 37 and a half feet of water depth. So we're gonna have to dredge that turning circle. So you'll see the greenish is North Sound, the light blue is the channel and turning basin that needs to be dredged from roughly 6-8 feet deep down to 37 and a half feet deep. So it's a lot of material that comes out. The channel going from the turning basin is roughly 2 miles long. It's not short. And it's based on those design guidelines for one-way traffic, not two-way, so only one ship at a time. It would be roughly 340 feet wide. And that is based on the size of the ship, the type of bottom, the speed of the ship, cross currents, winds, waves, all of those things that are expected at this location. So that is the concept for Site 3. And later on, we're going to talk more about this and what are some that we've done an environmental assessment, a transportation assessment, and a cost estimate of this location. Option 8. And you can see where it's located down towards breakers. So it's an option where we're going to build the terminal, the white rectangle, which is exactly the same as the previous one, on reclaimed land. Basically, the water is quite shallow there in Bodden Bay, on the east side of Bodden Bay. The seabed there is, in the middle, is about 2 feet deep, 3 feet deep, is very shallow. But we would have to build it up to about 10 feet above sea level. And that's to accommodate sea level rise in the future as well. So that would be reclaimed land. Basically, I don't like to say an island because it is connected to the mainland, but it's kind of like building an island. In front of that would be the berths, the wharf. That would need to be right at that location. It's roughly 10 feet deep, so we would have to deepen it for the ship basin. And along the south shore, we have a more aggressive wave climate. So essentially, when you're working ships, the waves can only be a certain height before the ship starts to, is to move and yaw, it starts to move and roll, and that way you can't even work the ship anymore because it's moving too much. In the case of containers, it's generally around 1.5 to 2 feet of waves, depending on the period. The longer the period, the smaller it is. But generally, that's as a rule of thumb, because we're at a concept level, you can't work the ship. Right now, offshore, waves off the shallows there, the waves exceed that amount, the 1.5 to 2 feet, 90% of the time. Which means if we didn't build a breakwater, 90% of the time you couldn't even offload the ship. For aggregate and cement and things like that, it's more around 3 feet of wave height, which is about 50% of the time the waves exceed that limit. So this location will require a breakwater. And the primary purpose of, there's a lot of ports in the world that have breakwaters. The primary purpose of the breakwater is to provide still water within the ship basin. So the water is still, even though it's rough on the outside, inside the ship basin, it's calm water and you can work the ship. It's also to protect the port during a storm event. So the breakwater would be designed for roughly, I think the significant wave height in a Category 5 hurricane would be roughly 7 meters high, so 20 feet high. So that breakwater would also serve that double purpose of protecting the port during a storm event. That's the basic premise of option 8. And the turning circle would be just outside the breakwater. That is a bit of a concern for us because they would still be subject to the waves. So although you're not working the ship, it's going to be a little bit trickier to turn the ship if it's an aggressive wave climate. So it is a concern with this case. But it would be even, you're going to see later, this is a very expensive option. It would be like way more expensive if we had to build the turning circle inside the breakwater, which is often done, but it's a huge cost. At Site 9, location 9, which you can see, which is up near the existing quarries at Breakers, we've developed 3 concepts at that location. So we're going to quickly look at 3 of them. But essentially, we looked at the quarries. There's existing quarries there, and they're basically, if you go out there, it's a huge pond. They primarily have already been excavated down to 30 feet deep, and the land around it is very, very low-lying, very flat and very low-lying. So we can do what's called a dugout port, and this is done around the world where someone wants to build a port. There's not a natural deep water harbor because that doesn't exist in Cayman, but basically they go and dig out the land and then connect that dugout port to open ocean with a channel. That's exactly what we're doing here. So in this case, we're taking advantage of that already large pond that's been excavated for the quarry down to roughly 30 feet. We will need to shape it some more and deepen it. But it provides, you can see it's roughly the size of the turning basin by coincidence. And then we would connect it to the ocean by excavating a channel out to the shoreline, and then from the shoreline out to the appropriate water depth, 37.5 feet of water, we would dredge a channel. And then adjacent to it, we could build up the terminal. Right now the land there is only about 2 to 4 feet above mean sea level. We want to raise that up to about plus 10. So we would take the material that we're excavating and put it and create the terminal. And then we could connect the terminal with a new road to the proposed east-west arterial, which is an important feature because, again, there's going to be a lot of truck traffic moving between this location, which is out east, back towards the west side of the island. A couple of features, the location of the channel. Currently there is no residential communities along that length of shoreline, so we're not displacing an existing waterfront home. As well as there's a lot of undeveloped land around the port. And what you'll often find, the situation you have in Grand Cayman is very common around the world. Ports are usually the first thing in a city. The city grows up around the port's constrained, and now we say, well, our port's growing and we need a new port, we're going to have to move the port outside of the city. It happens all over the place, trust me. I'm working on a big project in Perth, Australia. That's exactly what they're doing. They have the existing port in Fremantle. It cannot accommodate the growth, so they're going to shut it down, and they're going to build an entirely new port 30 kilometers away. Same thing happened in my hometown of Vancouver. We built a new port 30 kilometers away when the existing downtown ports, which were there for decades, just reached capacity. And what you'll find is when they build that new port, it'll attract industry to the port. So having available land around the port, not only to expand beyond the 2084, but to accommodate industry, is a good thing to have. It'll also reduce your trucking distances, so people can build their warehouses here, and so they have a short distance for trucking. A variation of this is 9B. All we did was turn the port 90 degrees and put it on the north side of that basin. Otherwise, everything is exactly the same. And that also shows you how this port could be expanded well beyond the 2084, because you could actually do 9B, and then later on you could do 9A. You know, again, you would double the size of the port. 9C, there's a, maybe I'll go back one. You'll see off to the right there is another dredged pond, a much smaller one, but we looked at, okay, what would be the difference if we used that pond instead? And that's the result. So although the channel, the shipping channel, is much, much shorter, we do require a lot more excavation at that turning basin. We're also a little bit concerned about this option, is that, you know, we do have a fairly aggressive wave climate along the south shore, and being such a ship channel, such a short ship channel, that the waves could travel up that channel and get inside the basin. Whereas on the previous option, that channel was considerably longer, and there's a better opportunity to attenuate those waves, because it's quite a long distance for them to travel up the channel, and they would probably, depending on the way they're coming in, they would essentially like peter out. But that's something that all needs to be confirmed in a lot more detail, with a lot more detailed engineering modeling in the future. The final concept option we're going to look at is option 10, very similar to number 8. It's on the west side of Frank Sound, outside of the Marine Reserve. It's close to the Marine Reserve, but it's not in the Marine Reserve. Frank Sound, the shallows go offshore much further, so you'll see that the terminal, which is built on reclaimed land again, sits further offshore, because we didn't play a lot with location and trying to balance fill. We didn't get into that sort of detail, but we thought the berth should be around the -5 depth now, so that's how we located it. You want the fill to be on relatively shallow, the shallows, and you want the ship basin to be in deep water, so it's a bit of a contradiction there. But essentially the same thing. Again, exposed to the wave climate, so we have a large breakwater, and then a turning circle. Half the turning circle is already in deep enough water. We don't have to dredge out, and not a lot of dredging for the top half of the turning circle. But essentially, vessels would arrive outside the breakwater. They would turn, generally they would turn and then reverse in. That's up to the captain, of course. So those are the 4 locations we've looked at. We ended up not developing a major expansion of the existing port, because when we looked at this, we needed roughly 40 acres of land, which would mean a substantial increase in size and land reclamation of the existing port. And basically, you'd end up building, you'd still use the CDC, so you're still double handling. We don't have to double handle on any of these options. If you use the CDC, you have to double. That's a lot of cost. But you'd still have to expand the land base of the existing port in front of Georgetown. You'd basically block out the entire waterfront of Georgetown. And I mean, we want to hear from you, but we didn't feel that was a viable option. And you still have the issue with crews. You still have the issue with traffic congestion. So with that, I get to take a little break, which is great. And I've been doing a lot of talking. I'm going to turn it over to Chris, who's going to talk about the environmental appraisal of each one of those options that you saw. And then I'll come back a little later. You're not done with me yet.
Thank you, Harold. So tonight, just want to go through what we've done so far on the environmental appraisal for the same project. So looking at the options that Harold's just been speaking to you about. And our objective for today for that introduction is to present the work that we've done so far, to outline the options and the considerations that we've made and the criteria that we've used to appraise those options. Tip it down. Sorry. And then look to you to give us some views on what you think about those options, but also to provide some background on any additional information for your concerns. Sorry, wrong way. So what we've done so far, we've looked at the short list of options. So Harold's spoken to you about how the long list was made down to a short list for those options. We've undertaken a data review, so we've looked at numerous sources of information gathered through the consultation that we've done with the stakeholders so far, but also just looking at information that's been available generally. We defined a study area for each of those options, the shortlist options. So the study area was 2 kilometres radius around each of the centre points of those options, and that was intended to cover any direct and indirect impacts that could occur. So obviously later on in any phase there'd be a full environmental impact assessment, so that would look into more detail about that. But for this appraisal we looked at a 2 kilometre radius. We undertook some consultation with key stakeholders. So we did go and talk to a few people already to gather information. That was gathering information and looking at initial concerns. And then defined the key criteria that we'd use for the appraisal. And then we defined a relative scoring. So we weren't looking in quantitative detail for each option, but we wanted to look at the relative scoring to give us a relative score for each of those, just to see which ones were coming out at a greater risk, greater environmental risk. So our initial consultation was with the Department of Environment, so they provided a lot of really useful information. We talked to the Ministry of Sustainability and Climate Resiliency, the National Trust and the National Museum. We've also today spoken to Sustainable Cayman and also to the Water Authority to get some more information. Ooh. Oh. No, it doesn't like that one.
It's on the...
So the criteria that we've used to look at each of those shortlist options was we've looked at the protected status of the area. So we've mapped any designated sites, any parks, nature reserves, marine reserves, and mapped those for each of those buffer zones. So for each of those 2 kilometre radius areas around every shortlist option, we've mapped all the protected sites. We've looked at the potential for the effect on known habitats and species, so any protected species, any protected habitats, any particularly sensitive species and habitats. We've also looked at the dredge area requirement for each option, and that's looking at capital and maintenance dredging. So not just the capital, but just looking at how often they'd need to be dredged if they were to be maintained that depth of channel. We've looked at recreational value, and that included looking at whether there were dive sites in that buffer zone, whether there were footpaths, whether there were marine parks that people would use, recreational parks, anything like that would be used were mapped. And then we looked at the visual impact, so how a port in that area might look to people, looked at where the sensitive receptors were, and mapped those all within the zone. We looked at heritage value, so whether there were any historic wrecks or any historic buildings within that zone that could be affected indirectly. We then looked at the distance to the local community, so how far to housing, how far to local community sites that would be used for recreation and effectively. We looked at potential for water pollution, both during construction and operation. So during construction, with the dredging process, there will obviously be lots of suspended sediments in, and potentially contaminant release from any contaminated sediments. But also for water pollution, we looked at during operation, what could be the potential for contingency planning and clearing up any pollution events that might happen. We then looked at the potential for expansion to affect the same environmental receptors. So if a port were to expand in the future, would these same issues come up again, or is there potential for expansion to happen with limited environmental issues? Doesn't like doing this. So this is just an example of the search area. So we've done the same for all of the options 1 and 2 and the other options that Harold's been through as well. So we did this 2-kilometre buffer zone and then mapped all of those resources within each site. So you can see the dive sites are in there and species information. So we've got turtle information, any sensitive species that could be affected. We've also got the sites mapped out for marine reserves, fishing zones, any designated areas. So the same thing was done for each of those sites. So we then came up with an environmental appraisal matrix, which has scored all of those criteria, and we've given a relative score. So it's not a score to say that this is a particularly significant impact, it's just relative to each other, what might the scores be. So for all of those options, we've done that, and we've given a score of between 0 to -4, with -4 being the greater risk that we considered for that particular criteria. And you can see that overall those scores are coming out, and then this is just for the environmental criteria. So for option 3, which was in North Sound, we've got quite a high risk, high negative risk level, which is what you'd expect from dredging in a very shallow environment. It would be going through an area of shallow habitat, nursery area. It's quite a sheltered area. There's a lot of negative scores because of the dredge surface area. Recreational value is high, critical habitats within the area, so there's a lot of issues with that site. But then obviously you've got the relative score for each of those. So the way forward now is to look at those options with your feedback as well. We're also getting feedback from DOE and the National Trust, and then look to confirm those relative scorings based on the above information that we've just been talking about, and also with any feedback that we get from you. So if you have any concerns about any of those sites particularly, if you could feedback back to us, we can help that feed into the matrix. And then select a preferred option based on multi-criteria analysis, which brings in a lot of other criteria that Harold's been talking about. So I'll hand back to Harold.
Right. I'm back. We're in the home stretch here. We're almost done, so just hang in there a little bit. I promise you, we're almost done. So very quickly, assessment of the transportation and the traffic. So essentially, the new port in 2084 would generate around 1,600 trips a day. So that's coming, roughly half of that's arriving at the port and half leaving. Around 1,000, a little over 1,000 of those are trucks. The rest are staff and labor. Option 3 would primarily connect to the Easterly Tibbetts Highway. And based on values and projections from the NRA, and we've had to project them further into the future, currently that highway handles 36,000 trips a day. Based on the population projections in the future, there would be over 100,000 trips on that highway. So obviously there's going to be bigger issues than the port around traffic. Options 8, 9, and 10 would primarily route the traffic up to the proposed east-west arterial extension. And in 2084, the volumes expected on that proposed highway is in the order of around 90,000 trips. So really, the message here is the port is going to add less than 2% to the background traffic for any of those things. So there's going to be a lot more serious traffic issues when you're dealing with that sort of population growth than just the port. Costs. So we've done what's called Class 5 cost estimates. Class 5 cost estimates are very high level, and they're not considered accurate enough for setting a budget. That's why we're not presenting the costs tonight, because they don't really represent, they're not accurate enough to present a budget for the project. But what we can do, that level allows us to compare relative costs from one option to the other. So what we've done is we've ranked those options from the lowest cost to the highest cost, and we've shown you what the relative difference is. So the lowest cost option is option 9B. 9C and A, which remember were quite similar, only about 5% higher cost. Option 3 in the North Sound, primarily because that long channel had to be dredged, is about 18% higher cost than 9B. Option 10 and 8, if you recall, had that breakwater, and that breakwater was very costly. And as a result, options 10 and 8 are anywhere from 34 to 52% higher cost. So they were dramatically more expensive, and that was primarily because of the breakwater. Really quickly, I'm going to go through this really quickly. So now we are looking at a potentially new port, which would open 10 to 15 years from now. So what do we do at the existing port? Because if you look back at the cargo is going to continue to grow. Remember, at 2% annual growth in population for the next 10 to 15 years. And the existing port just can't handle that volume. So at the existing port, a big issue we heard is the existing South Pier. It's very difficult to side discharge 2 ships at the same time because the pier is too narrow. So what's being proposed at the existing port is to widen and slightly lengthen the existing pier. And that way you could truly work and side discharge 2 vessels at the same time. And we'd have to do a little bit of dredging. Excuse me, sorry. So fairly minor project we feel would allow the vessels to be handled for the next 10 to 15 years at the port. At the CDC, we would still rely on the CDC. So what you'll see there is you'll see again those familiar blue squares. That's additional container storage. And we really didn't want to spend a lot of money at the CDC because remember, once the new port opens, this becomes redundant. So really we can put containers into available space that's at the CDC now. The LCL warehouse, you'll see the yellow, we would double the size of the LCL warehouse. It's probably in the final few years is not enough, but they could potentially rent some warehouse space off of the port, down the street. It's not the greatest because you've got to move, got to sort of double handle cargo. But again, it'll get you through those final 4 or 5 years before that new port opens. By extending the warehouse, we displace a lot of the auto storage, so we would relocate auto storage into the location you've seen there. Right now, there's a number of small modular buildings. We would take down those buildings and build a new multi-story office. Buildings aren't that expensive, so we would build a new office. We would probably, in the last few years, run out of space for autos, so again, the recommendation is, rent a gravel parking lot somewhere, lease some space, if we had to move some cars off, and that's a double handling, it adds cost, but it's only for a very short term. So those are the things that have been looked at, what could be done at the existing port in the CDC to get us through those 10 or 15 years before a new facility were to open. So closing, we're there, last slide, yay. The existing port and the CDC is at or near capacity. It's really congested now. There's a lot of issues, primarily because of the sharing with crews, space limitations, all of those things. Upgrades to the existing port to accommodate short-term growth, basically that growth over the next 10 to 15 years, is urgently needed now. The port is struggling to keep up with the growing volume, so those plans that you just saw really need to proceed. The sooner the better. The new port, if you're going to get a new port open in 10 or 15 years, you need to start that process now. It really does take 10 to 15. It sounds like a long time. Oh, wow, you got 15 years to build this port. But by the time you go through your environmental process and securing financing and doing the design and doing procurement and picking a contractor and doing construction, the construction alone is probably 4 to 5 years. You really need to start now. Every year you lose is going to, that'll become 16 years and 17 years and 18 years very quickly. Both projects should really, and the sooner it can open, the less money you have to spend at the existing port. Both projects should and they should proceed simultaneously. And then just where we are now, so we're now in the public consultation phase. We're very, very excited and very eager to hear from you in a few minutes. And we expect to complete the outline business case, the report, probably in the next few weeks once we get your feedback. And then that will go to the government. And from that, no preferred option. The option hasn't been selected. We have options. There's no preference right now at which one it's going to be. I think we have an idea. You may all have ideas, but that decision has not been made at this point. That decision will then go to the government with a recommendation, and they will make the decision of which one to move forward with. And, that was it anyway. So the next slide said questions. So we're ready to, I don't know why I did that. Well, that was the last slide. So we're ready to hear from all of you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Westerman, and to Ms. Andit. I'd like to now ask all the panelists to please come on stage. Well, that was a lot of information to digest, but it's time now to open up the floor for questions. If you have a question, please make your way to the mic. As soon as our panelists are seated, we will proceed with questions. If you have a question, please make your way to the mic, yes, as the panelists come to the stage. So we'll have questions coming from the floor, and after a few questions, then we'll go to questions from Slido. For those of you who've been sending in your questions on Slido, we have a lot of questions, as you can see, but we'll get as many as we can answered tonight. We're going to ask everyone to please ask one question, just so that everybody gets a chance to ask the questions that they need to have answered. Okay, you ready, Mr. Bush?
Yes, ma'am, thank you. I want to thank the minister and ministry for giving us this opportunity. I want to thank the panel and everyone here that showed up. If I understand the idea of the cargo is to facilitate all handling of all cargo in its facility, correct? In the new port.
Mr. Westerman, please use your mic. Yeah, no worries, thanks.
The exception would be the gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and the LPG, which we assumed would continue to be handled at Sol, Rubis, and Home Gas. But yes, all the other cargoes would move to the new facility.
Okay, thank you for that. See, one of the issues I see with those options is, as a small little island, our population, yes, is growing, tremendous. But just imagine we had one supermarket. Just think about that for 1 second. With the growth that we have one cargo distribution center when we should have 3 or 4 cargo distribution centers, because ships can be stacked in a way. You got eastbound cargo, you got central cargo, and you got westbound cargo. The whole island don't need to go to one area to get their stuff. Your vehicles, your building materials, and whatever other supplies you have. They can all be handled overnight. We're sleeping, wake up in the morning, your stuff is in your district. So this congestion of traffic that we have is based on how we facilitate our port. We need to distribute our port.
Thank you, Mr. Bush.
There is a good location. There was another plan drawn years ago. Everybody's familiar with where old Jesse Jeeps area was in town. There was a 3-finger pier, which would hold 6 ships, and no dredging was needed for the ships. The water depth was enough. The piers would have been on stilts, which did not disturb a flow of the sand that moves from 7 Mile to South Sound. Our currents move the beaches up and down across the waterfront in Georgetown. That's why when you look at a satellite photo, you see the light area, the darker areas, and the darker areas. That's the current moving our sand back and forth. Jester Jeeps area provided a direction where we could build a highway straight to the distribution center. From there, we could move cargo outwards. So when stuff come off of ships, we had loading in areas where the cargo would have went on Pacific trucks to go to Pacific locations. That's my feedback.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bush. As we get some answers or response, any answers or response from the panelists, whoever would like to ask a question, please make your way to the mic for us. Please, thanks. And if we can stick to one question, the comment, that'll be great. It'll give more people in the room a chance to respond. She's just going to fix the mic for you. Give her a quick second. Thanks.
Good night, everyone. Forgive me, as I'm a little nervous. Don't really like to public speak, but
I'm going to need you to speak into the mic for me, please.
my name is Nicholas Foster. I'm a fishing guide here on the island, also a young local Caymanian. The proposed area of 8, 9, and 10, that is one area where I do 50% of my trips, and also that area that you were calling reclaimed land, that is barrier reef. There is conchs, lobsters, everything in that one spot. Developing that and putting a port there would be a terrible, terrible idea. I've mentioned this to the minister many times, but yeah, man, it's a very sensitive spot environmental-wise. It would be very detrimental to that flat. It would not only affect the wildlife there, but it would open up that south coast there, compromise us, the barrier reef. These guys may not be concerned with it, but 50% of my trips are done there. I have a picture right now with a family fishing on that reef. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, young man. Anyone from the panel would like to respond? Okay, who's next?
Yeah.
To the mic?
Sorry, can I?
Okay,
Yeah.
Christine would like to respond. Sir, you can just stay at the mic. Stay at the mic, and then she'll respond.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's useful to know. I mean, there's obviously some information that hasn't come through that process of data searches, but I'm not sure if there's any information that you can provide to us through. Yeah, no, that would be useful if you can send that through to us so we can put that in for consideration anyway. But
I'd also like to mention before we go to Mr. Platt that there is a survey online that you can go and complete and put your concerns or your recommendations in there. If you go online to gov.ky-tourism transport, the survey is there on the homepage. So I think your input would be vital there as well. Mr. Platt, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Courtney Platt, and I appreciate his comments. As a fisherman, and the value of the reef in that area, it's a huge area that you guys are talking about dredging up and then kind of burying in this project. So as an environmentalist myself, and with some marine biology background, thousands of dives here in Cayman over the years that I've been here. And I got myself in trouble economically fighting against the cruise berth plan with my photography to prove that the reef in the harbor was actually healthier and more vibrant even than the rest of the island, which was shown in the EIA as well. But there were arguments that were saying there's nothing there to save, and that's wrong. However, despite all of that, it's clear to me that expanding the current operation where it is would be far less damaging to the environment than proceeding with this plan on the South Coast that is hugely, enormously a bigger environmental disaster for us. We have overfished our reefs. We desperately need to restore our reef fish population for our strategic food reserve, for daily food for the poor. Caymanians need to be able to catch fish for dinner, just for survival. And a day may come when it hits the fan. I leave out the SH. When it hits the fan and cargo ceases coming in for some reason, world war, disease, who knows what, and we'll need a strategic food reserve. We can't do that with agriculture. We've already put houses on our best agricultural land, and we continue to do so. To me, as we have just barely solved our recent really dire traffic problem, it seems it should be very obvious to the island that before proceeding with a project like this, we really ought to just do the least amount of environmental damage we can by enhancing the port where it is. And sorry, I'm getting locked here. I
Take your
lost my
time.
train of thought. But that's it, population. Sorry. And I should have begun by thanking Minister Bryan for this opportunity to speak. I really appreciate our democracy. This is a wonderful place to live. And I've been here the past 43 years watching it decline, decline, decline. The marine environment decline, the terrestrial environment decline, access to the beaches decline, et cetera, et cetera. And it all comes down to this. Sorry, I took a long time to get to the point. But this is the point. Population. We talk as though there is no way we can limit our population growth. And to me, that is the single most important thing we should be doing first and foremost before considering this kind of infrastructure expansion is control our growth in pace with our infrastructure, right? Can we do it? And that's really the main issue that I see for all of our woes. Crime, the traffic, terrestrial environmental destruction, central mangrove wetlands, the marine environment itself, and the ability for us to feed our population.
Thank you, Mr. Platt. Sir, please go to the mic. That's you.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Chris Pope, local businessman, also involved with the port quite a bit. I have really two questions, but they're both connected. The first one is you've spoken an awful lot about the timeline on the new port facility, but you didn't really specify the short term, meaning how long do you anticipate that is going to begin and finish? That's the first part. The second part for the new port facility really speaks to what type of discharge technology you're going to employ. Are you going to stay with the shore cranes, or are you going to implement a mandate for vessels to come here to use ship's gear instead? That's it.
Mr. Westerman?
So we haven't developed detailed schedules, but that plan, those short-term improvements for the port and the CDC, that also needs to go through an environmental impact assessment and then the tendering and construction process. I would anticipate that process would probably be around, by the time those facilities open, 4 to 5 years. The CDC, the work at the CDC can happen a lot faster because you're just really upgrading an existing facility. The expansion and the widening and the lengthening of the South Pier, that would go through a more exhaustive EIA, and there's probably something like that would take about a year to build, roughly. You're talking another year and a half for design and procurement, so that would give you 2.5 years to permit it. So 4 to 5 years, I would anticipate. As far as offloading, the containers would continue to be offloaded with cranes. The cranes that are at the port now are really old. I think they anticipate those, and for those sorts of volumes, you're looking at a similar mobile harbor crane for offloading the containers. Some of the containers do arrive at Ro-Ro, so they're actually on a trailer, they're driven off, so there is a Ro-Ro ramp on those plans. Cement would be, you can get a pneumatic machine for pneumatically offloading bulk cement, which would go into the silos, so that's how the cement would come off. Autos come off in containers, so there's right now about 20% of the autos actually come in a container. So the container arrives and they actually open the doors and drive the car out. The rest of them just are driven off the ship. And then aggregates would be offloaded with ship's gear. So there's not anticipating for those volumes to have a shore-based ship unloader. It could. I mean, you could use the mobile harbor crane for that if so chosen. And then the break bulk comes off by crane, by Ro-Ro, all kinds of various methods. So similar to what you see today at the port.
Okay, I'm going to go to 3 questions from Slido, some of which are from you in the audience, and then we'll come back to the mic. This first question asks, given the wording of the survey and posters in the room, when was the decision taken to abandon the solution of expanding the Georgetown Harbor, the best SOC option? We've been discussing that, but if you could kind of reiterate for persons who may be listening and those in the room for us, please. Would you like me to repeat the question?
The decision to not look at the existing port in the long term really developed over time, and the first big question was what happens to cruise. So if people believe that cruise is going to continue at that location, there's always going to be that conflict. Basically, the cruise takes over during the day, and that really does put a severe constraint on the existing port. I haven't seen a port around the world that operates like this, where you only can operate at night. So that's a big constraint. If the port, let's say cruise were to cease or go away or whatever, you'd still have to expand the port. And if you recall, the existing port is around, between the port and the CDC, is around 19 acres. And we require, as if it were just all port contiguous, not split up like it is today, 40 acres. So where does that 40 acres come from? It'll be a combination of a substantial expansion of the existing port, i.e. basically filling in a large portion of the waterfront in Georgetown. So the entire waterfront of Georgetown would essentially be blocked by cranes and containers and ships, as well as a significant expansion of the CDC. And we're still dealing with that double handling, i.e. the cargo comes off a ship into the port, and then it all has to be moved inland. Very, very few ports around the world operate that way because you're double handling all the cargo, and it adds a tremendous amount of additional operational cost to the port. So when we saw it was sort of evolved over time. With the cruise, we always knew there was going to be a problem with the cruise. And then later on, when we started to see the numbers, the cargo forecast and the amount of land and the amount that's needed for the new port, it appeared to us that the expansion would be so substantial in Georgetown and the CDC, it just didn't appear reasonable. Now, that can change, but it's not a matter of just expanding the port a little bit. It's a huge expansion of what's there now.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Westerman. The next question from Slido asked, It says, the government just invested in a public beach in Breakers, and now they are considering dredging the area, so our people will have to swim next to the cargo ships. Kind of a statement, question. Anybody want to address that on the panel?
So the thing to remember at Breakers, we have three options there. We had number 8 and number 10, which were built in the shallows. So there's, without a doubt, there are significant impacts to the seabed and to the aquatic environment, because you're building that 40-acre terminal right on top of shallow land. You're dredging out a large area. You're building a breakwater. So there's no doubt there's a significant impact there. But then you also look at Site 9, where we're building the port inland. We're building it away from the shoreline. So the only impact to the aquatic habitat, and Chris may want to add to this, is just the narrow channel, the channel with ships going up and down. So it's the area that's impacted is, I mean, there's impact, there's no doubt about it, but it's substantially less than what you had with option 8 and 10.
Okay, thank you very much. The third question so far from Slido asks, how is this being considered in regards to efforts to update the development plan? Better to wait until the people have had their say on the new plan?
Give a stab at that one. So again, this process is about gathering input. So we came up with options, and now we're looking for feedback from the public. We realize that any example of a port is not going to be ideal. But what we're saying is, looking forward, looking at population growth, there is going to be a need for additional infrastructure to what we have now. So again, yes, in tandem with the National Development Plan, but again, they are looking at population growth and the GDP, everything expanding, more services, more goods coming in, and we are looking at that as well in terms of the infrastructure needed to meet that.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Bodden. There was someone at the mic. Please, can someone quickly make their way to the mic for us? We'll have 3 more questions from the mic and then go back to Slido.
No one is coming. My name is Walton Gooding. I probably would not go where my friend here went. Thanks for your presentation. What really struck me the most is your population growth expectation. And that really took me back. My question is, first off, I like 9A. I like 9A, even before listening to the course. The question I have is, have you all considered moving the cargo by rail? Because we keep thinking about trucking. If you bring the cargo to a point, and then you can put rail in to distribute to different areas, whether it's a district or something, but rail. I think rail would really lessen the need for more roads and trucks and stuff like that. I believe in big cities, I see sometimes like rail going by and there's so much cargo moving from point A to point B, right? So I'm just wondering if in any of your consideration you consider moving stuff by rail. Cayman is relatively flat.
Thank you, Mr. Gooden. Anyone from the panel?
The answer is no, and I can explain why. Rail, when you're in a big city and you see the cargo moving by rail, it's generally going thousands of miles inland. I know where I'm from, in Vancouver, anything within roughly a 600-mile distance of the port moves by truck, not by rail, because the cost is substantially more. Now, one thing that can be different, now, so you have to remember, when the goods come into the port, they leave the port and they're going to be distributed amongst the entire island. There's going to be cargo that goes to West Bay. There's going to be cargo that stays in the East End. There's cargo that goes to Georgetown. It kind of moves all over the place. It starts at the port, but it then gets picked up by the importers and gets distributed around. So you would need rail lines going everywhere, and that's just not practical. What you could do, what has been proposed, no one has ever done it, is to have an inland port. So basically everything comes into the port and it goes on to rail and moved to a inland port location. That's been proposed many times, but generally when people look at the cost, because again, you're double handling that volume. You're basically taking the cargo off a ship, you're putting it on the ground, then you have to pick it up again, put it on a train, then you've got to rail it to the inland location. Then you have to take it off the train. So you're handling that cargo, and it adds tremendously to the cost of handling that cargo. But it has been looked at. The Port of Los Angeles, for example, has proposed a maglev, not a train, but a maglev to move cargo inland. Was never done because the cost was just too high, and they couldn't generate a business case for it. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much. Sir with the hat, I believe you were next.
Hi, good evening, panel. All right. What I was saying, like up by Pedro Castle, right? You guys can put a...
Sir, I need you to speak into the
Yes,
mic for
sorry,
those at
sorry.
home. Sorry.
You can put a dock there on the waterfront by Pedro Castle, say 1,000 feet long. A big cruise ship can come in there, all right? And a crane can stay on the east side of that cement area. So if a cargo boat cannot unload in Georgetown, it can unload up by Pedro Castle. So you can do like a multi-purpose dock right there. Right by the iron shore, you got 40 to 50 feet, all right? The Royal Caribbean Icon ship, which is one of the biggest cruise ships, she draws 30 feet and 3 inches, all right? Right next to the iron shore, you got a drop off, which is 110 feet. I'm not asking nobody, I'm telling you because I am a scuba diver, probably just me, Courtney, are scuba divers up in here. The water is very deep. So a dock can be made right there against the iron shore, and you don't have to destroy no whole heap of coral. All right? Then down below that, probably maybe say a quarter mile. All right, you got a place, it's a road, it's called Bougainvillea Lane, where you see like a big inner tree where people be selling fruits and stuff under that tree.
Sir, I need you to speak into the mic. I'm so sorry.
You go straight down from that lane, you'll see it's a big piece of property right there. The iron shore basically straight. You can put a long-term dock right there. It's plenty of property that could serve as a cargo dock for about 30 years. All right? The water is deep right there. The water is deep right there. So you guys are looking, or like the song we talk about, you're looking in the wrong place for love. You're looking in the wrong place to put these docks, digging up, digging up. You don't have to do all of that. You want to go by Pedro Castle, and down below Pedro Castle, that's where you can find the right spot. And talking about the dock in Georgetown, all right, it can be built on stilts, maybe 3-foot stilt, near out to the drop-off. The drop-off starts at 110 feet. I'm not asking you, I'm telling you, because one time, me and my boss, we had to go and scuba dive one Jamaican guy that got drowned off a cargo boat. All right? So we ended up having to go and find him, so I know the depth of that water. Ding dock cannot come straight out from the cargo dock because you got the wreck of the Balboa, which happened in 1932, that was blown up by the English Navy, so the cargo boats coming in there would not end up hitting it. But if you use from the Royal Water Terminal and go straight out, all right? See, I got a drawing right here. You got two pieces of reef. This here connects together with a small piece of reef, all right? If you put the dock on pilings, say maybe 30 to 40 feet apart, you can go right over the coral. You do not have to move one piece of coral. You do not have to move one piece of coral straight out to the drop off, and you can put a certain distance on the dock where the big cruise ship can come in, all right? That extension can come down by steps, down to the Royal Water Terminal, by steps right here. But you can also, people, you know, with like little scooters and stuff like that, you can have a small, like a forklift or something like that. Some way of getting the people up and down. You put like a box, all right, on the forklift. Somebody come with a scooter, they get on, put them in a box, forklift reverse, puts the people right down on the lower step. When the people come back, pick them up in a box, put them up on top. The box shuts. As soon as people get in, you lock the box, people get out, undo it, and they're going about their business.
Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to wrap up for us so that we can have other persons ask questions as well.
Okay.
Thank you so
But
much for your
guys,
feedback.
Look at the Pedro Castle, in the front of Pedro Castle, and down below that. And look at all the millions of dollars Pedro Castle would make from this investment. All right?
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. Anyone from the panel would like to respond?
Sure. So first of all, the mandate of the OBC is not to look at cruise. So none of these port plans that you saw today have been developed to accommodate a cruise ship. And in fact, based on the size of that channel, a cruise ship, unless it's a very small one, but the ships that you primarily get out here in Georgetown could not use that port. They just can't access it. So the mandate of the OBC is to only accommodate cargo ships, not cruise ships. I'm not fully familiar with the sites the gentleman was talking about, but he talked a lot about really deep water. Really deep water is not a good thing, believe it or not, because when you have to build a pier in very deep water, the cost goes up dramatically. So 100 feet of water is, you just do not want to build there because the cost goes up enormously. Now that may accommodate the pier, but what's really important is, and as well on the, I think Pedro Castle's along the south coast, so now you're exposed to the wave action. And you have to, for the cargo ships, you need to protect that again with the breakwater, and then you'd end up building a breakwater in deep water, which makes its costs go up exponentially. Thirdly, you can build, let's say the water is not deep, let's say it's 40 feet deep, just the right depth. You build the breakwater, you build the pier, we still need the 40 acres of land. So for example, your drawing there was just for the pier. We still need a lot of land for the storage and operation of the cargo, roughly 40 acres, so that needs to take it into account. And I think I know where Pedro, I'm not 100%, but I think what's also, for example, when we looked at site 7 and 11, the land was up quite high. You can't have the land base, ideally we want the land to be around 10 feet up. If it's 20 or 30 feet high, we have to actually take it all down to 10 feet. You can't have a dock sitting 10 feet above the water level and the land behind it up 20 or 30 feet. It just creates a lot of problems operationally for the port. So that was one of the things we found at location 7 and 11 is we had too deep of water close to shore, which made the breakwater not feasible, made the dock very expensive, and then the land, the shoreline were steep bluffs that went up quite high, 20, 30 feet, and all that land would have to be excavated and knocked down to get down to the roughly 10 feet. Now, I haven't seen exactly the location you're looking at, but I think it's similar to what we were just talking about.
Thank you, Mr. Westerman. Mr. Rankin, please go ahead with your question, and after Mr. Rankin's question, we're going to go back to Slido. Please go
Sure,
ahead.
already introduced me as Mr. Rankin. My opinion is based on our elders' findings and opinion. I'm surprised that the site that they suggested didn't make the short list, which is number 5. The elders I'm speaking about is the late Captain Charles Cocornell and Mr. Bobby Soto and other elders that knew their terrain, the ocean well. And it was even drawn up a plan that it went as far as the floor of the Legislative Assembly. It never got the majority votes, so it never went through. But that also had a option of creating a mega yacht facilities. So my question is, the sites that you all are suggesting, would that also be able to facilitate, like for a mega yacht, like a mega yacht marina?
Again,
Thank you, Mr. Rankin.
so again, the mandate was to strictly look at cargo. I believe each one of those sites could be expanded to accommodate yachts if that was the desire of the Port Authority or the government or whichever body. You know, the yachts could use that turning circle, they could use that channel, and adjacent to the main cargo terminal, you could build those facilities. But we were focused strictly on cargo because there's an issue with cargo now. As far as site location 5, it was sort of being represented by option 3. So what we said was we have 3, 4, and 5. Option 3 would be the least amount of impact to the aquatic habitat. So if 3 were found to be unacceptable from an environmental perspective because there's too much impact to North Sound, then by reasoning 4 and 5 would be also considered unreasonable because they're going to have more significant impacts. Now, if it comes out that everyone, you know, the consensus is that, yeah, well, 3's not that bad. You know, we can live with that impact to North Sound, i.e. a 2-mile channel, then that could potentially bring back 4 and 5. So that's the consideration there.
Thank you very much, Mr. Westerman. We're going to take a couple of questions from Slido, and then we're going to come to you, Mr. Schmidt. The next question from Slido asks, which private and non-profit organizations have been consulted on the business plan? Which private and non-profit organizations have been consulted on the business plan?
Yeah, it's a long list. I mean, I'm sure we can find a way to provide the list of stakeholders that have been consulted. I mean, we've spoken. 30? Yeah, there's about 30 on the list. You've got supermarkets, you've got shipping companies, you've got shipping agents, developers, construction. There's a whole range, but we can provide the list.
Okay. The next question is, did the ministry consult with other government agencies on the business case?
Yeah.
Okay.
So as part of the business case in terms of stakeholder consultations, yes, we've spoken to. I think Harold mentioned some of them at the start of the presentation. So DOE, is it national NRA, yeah, Public Works, National Trust.
Hazard management.
Yeah.
Ministry of Sustainability and Climate Resilience and the Water Authority.
Okay. The third question for this round is, it asks, how does the Cayman Islands government foresee this project being financed?
So financing is something that gets discussed after the public stakeholder consultation, because I think, as we've tried to make clear today, there's no set in stone preferred option at this stage. We need to take in everything we hear today, and some of the points today are very valid points that we need to go away and look at. So once we get more close towards a preferred option, we then look in much more detail at affordability. And as part of those discussions on affordability, we look at the potential procurement route that we might need to go down. So whether that's a direct procurement with it being government funded, or if that means that debt finance is required, or project finance, all the way through. So we look at the full spectrum through to a PPP. And I think one of the points made about the marina, something like that, you know, if that factored into one of the options, that could be a way to reduce the overall cost for government, because if there are extra revenue streams that can be obtained from a project like this, that can then offset against the cost that the government would have to incur. But to answer the question shortly, it's the next stage that we look at that.
Okay, and what do you mean when you say PPP?
Sorry, a public-private partnership. So where private sector would be involved looking at financing, potentially having some involvement in the project itself. But I think part of what we've discussed is that we want to retain control of the cargo port with the Port Authority of the Cayman Islands. So those discussions are all had at the steering committee level, and we talk through all of those different options and make sure that, you know, we have, as part of the Green Book guidance, we have these critical success factors we have to look at, and so we consider all of those things and discuss it with the steering committee to make sure that all the options are considered, and that, as I say, that goes hand in hand with the affordability question and how it's financed.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Story. Mr. Schmidt, please go ahead with your question.
Thank you and good evening. Thank you for the comprehensive presentation. It was interesting. The problem I have is with some of the assumptions that are being made in terms of population growth over that time period which you spoke about. I have looking at the population today, and of course I've been here long enough to see the rapid increase, is that a lot of our population, I believe, is transient. And our economy would have to be the foundation of my understanding of our economy would have to change to where we have a different reason for the population to keep growing. I think the product from a tourism perspective is finite, and the more we overbuild the island, we're going to resemble Singapore or other places like that. And but I don't think the same argument as in Singapore can be made when you have consideration for a port. So I'm having a difficult time imagining 250,000 permanent residents on this island and having an economy that would sustain that kind of population. And if that assumption is not correct, if the linear growth, as you have explained, you took the middle rate in terms of population growth, compounded, mind you, but still. So I think it is a difficult case for me to understand that this island could have a population of 250,000 people within 40 years, and even though it flattens out after that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schmidt. While we have the question answered, can the next person please go to the mic?
So I think on population, from the perspective of the project, what we have to do is to make sure that the end product of all of this work isn't a cargo port that can't actually meet the capacity. So we do have to look at it from not necessarily as a sort of a worst case scenario, but we have to make sure that the cargo port is going to be able to deal with various scenarios of population growth and various scenarios of volumes of cargo that comes through the port. So we don't necessarily, you know, as Harold said in the presentation, we can't predict what the population will be, and there's a load of political and economic factors that will help shape where the population does end up. But from our perspective, we just want to make sure that we are looking at all the various kind of sources and estimates and forecasts that are out there, and that we've got some kind of idea of where population and cargo volumes could get to, so that we don't, you know, create or design a cargo port that then couldn't deal with capacity.
Okay, ma'am, before we go to you, Minister Bryan has something to say.
Good evening again. I think that was a wonderful question, Mrs. Smith, in respect to the context of the population, because the population keeps on popping up as a reason. And I thought I would ask this question to Harold, because I would rather be able to ask you in front of my people than behind the closed door and I get the information and they don't quite understand the context of your answer. So there's two parts. Before I ask the question and leave you to answer, I want us to rationalize also the imports is not only for the population of people. We are in the tourism business. It's our second main industry. Those persons who come here either by cruise or by stayover have to consume goods upon which we have imported. So the rate of the tonnage imported is not based on the population. So though we do, I agree, most people know my position on immigration reform, at least have an idea. So I agree with you, there's some population concerns that we have to do as a country to justify and critique, but that itself will not stop the tonnage growth, and I'll explain to you shortly. Mr. Harold, in respect to the timeline of where or before we run out of space, what population amount that is? Because we're talking, people are taking away the quarter, 250,000 people, 250,000 people in their minds. But there is a point upon which, even if we don't get to 250, that the current facilities that we have will stop at. We're currently at 82,000 now, and we understand that that is stretched. How much further can the current cargo facility go by way of your projections? So give us an idea of where that stop point would be if we wanted to do nothing.
So the answer to that is the current port can handle very little more population. I mean, it's already congested now. What I can say is those plans that we showed, the widening of the South Pier at the existing port and shuffling things and reconfiguring things a little bit at the CDC, did not include expanding the CDC, just working with the land base of the CDC now. Those plans were developed to handle the cargo up till 2039, which corresponds to a population of 133,000. So those plans, that's where you'd be. Beyond that, then you'd have to continue to do more. I mean, you can do lots of little increments. You can continue to do more. You could then start to expand the CDC and expand the port, but to get to the 2084, you're talking, as the growth goes, it's more and more expansion. Now, the thing to also keep in mind when you're dealing with the population number, if a new port opens, yes, we've designed it for the cargo that corresponds to 250,000. The port would be, we haven't done the phasing, so you'd probably open up with a little bit less infrastructure. You would have to build the channel and the turning basin. You could probably start with 2/3 of the wharf and add to it down the road. But you would then reevaluate how the population is growing, and you'd add those little incremental changes. So it means that the port, if the growth is slower, then what you've built is going to last well beyond 2084. If the growth is faster, you're going to fill up that port, it's going to maybe max out in 2074. So you just don't know exactly, because again, projecting population 60 years from now is, it's a best estimate a guesstimate almost. So you would adjust how you implement the port and when you implement phases of that plan over time.
Thank you, Mr. Westerman. Ma'am, please go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Virginia Hobday. Thanks very much. I'm a resident of Breakers. I understand, I mean, the population thing is the crux of the matter, and several people have alluded to that. Yeah. And I agree with the previous speaker that you can't assume that we're going to go to 250,000. I think before you start looking at your ports, you better start looking at your roads, you better start looking at your schools, you better start looking at a whole bunch of things before you just say we're going to have 250,000 people here. I'm glad I'm going to be dead when it happens. My sons are not, though. You know, in 50, 60 years, they'll be here. And our house is about 100 yards from the quarries on the waterfront. We look right down Pease Bay. It's pristine. And it's emotional.
Thank you, Ms. Virginia.
Anyway, I would just ask you to really consider this very seriously, and expanding the port until you know what you want to do would seem to me to be a better thing to do, because at least you know, you can decide, do you want to have a population of 250? You can control that population if you want. So you don't really have to design for this, even if you have tourism. So I think, you know, you need to take a step back, look at your other infrastructure, and stop destroying the natural habitat. The massive sort of impact on the marine there, it'll never recover, and it'll never be the same. So, you know, don't destroy a new place. Try and build on what you already have, and which we've already destroyed there, but at least we've got it, and we can extend it out. I don't think you need to put in another port in a place like that where you could expend what you want. And over the next 5 years, have a serious conversation about population growth and about infrastructure.
Thank you, Ms. Virginia. Young lady, please go ahead.
Good evening. Thank you for being here tonight and for all your hard work. I am a young Caymanian, and I am concerned about the state of democracy in our country. I would like to request that the ministry conducts more public consultation meetings and extends the survey deadline, because at present it is August 2nd. And you want to make sure as many people participate as possible, and I'd even also suggest conducting focus groups, particularly with youth activists and young Caymanians. And yeah, I completely agree with the sentiments. We have to have vision and planning for the future, and also understand the data and the economics behind our decisions. For example, there's an economist, her name is Marla, and I can't really pronounce her last name, Dukran. She released a report on evaluating actually exactly how much tourism is contributing to our economy. And I think we need to understand the numbers before we make decisions that not only impact at the present ability to function and import and, you know, sustain society, but also will have rippling effects for generations to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have about 13 minutes left of the meeting, so we're going to go to the final questions on Slido. The next question on Slido asks, whichever solution is recommended, will it be subject to an environmental and EIA? Yes?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, thank you very much. The next question asks, why is the consultation period so short?
The consultation period, so we're having 2 meetings, as we all know. We have the survey. We can extend that. I don't think that's an issue. That can be done. We're open to other suggestions in terms of how we can get more or varied consultations. So just let us know through the survey.
Okay. Yes, sir.
I kind of figured that question would have come up, so I prepared for it. The consultants that are here are specialists from overseas. We have to fly them in. Some of them actually came in on Monday? Yeah. So we specifically had them here. Actually, we're competing with Plan Cayman. We were competing with Parliament and so forth. And if they required it necessary, unfortunately, one of the amazing advisors are retiring, and he actually came out of retirement just to come to advise the Cayman Islands on this, because he's a very wanted individual across the world in respect to his his expertise. So that's the reason why we crammed it into these 2 meetings. I mean, as Cayman, we can come out and make our voice be heard, and do things online. We're technology efficient enough to give them the feedback they need. They're very intelligent individuals to get the sentiment. So having a meeting another 3 weeks from now to hear the same thing, that's why we're recording tonight, so we can plant it out there so people can hear all the technical details that was set out. And then you have the online survey to give your comments. And over the next month, they will be going through that bit by bit from a technical standpoint to advise the cabinet. So hopefully that answers. We muddled over this a while, actually fought with my team, said, listen, I don't want to be accused of not giving the public enough time to have consultation, but the consultation is getting the feedback and listening to it and factored in their recommendations to us, and I think they were going to be able to accomplish that. I'm very happy with the turnout tonight. The numbers are good on Facebook. People take advantage of the survey as well as on YouTube, and I think we're going to be able to get a true sentiment of the public.
Thank you very much. Another question from Slido. It's actually more of a comment, recommendation. Why no live poll on site preference? If you want our opinions, you could add this now. So why no live poll on site preference? Was that a consideration? Can it be considered?
I think in terms of, so the survey does capture site preference. One of the main questions on there is to rank the sites in order of preference. In terms of why not do it live, I mean, we don't want to necessarily shape people's views a certain way, and sometimes if you're looking at something live, it can in some ways alter
Skew?
And skew the results and alter what you actually input. So I mean, all of the results will be an appendix to the outline business case, so it will be publicly available. But we didn't see the need to do it live.
Okay. One final question from Slido. I'm going to take one final question from the audience, and then we're going to wrap up. And tomorrow night is another night for another meeting in Boddentown. This final question from Slido, there were lots of questions, by the way. This is just a few of them. I know a lot of people in the room and those at home asked a lot of questions that cannot be answered tonight because of time. So this question asks, what criteria was used to determine the short list of options?
So as part of the Green Book guidance, so our business cases in Cayman follow the UK HMT Green Book guidance, which is a sort of a very formulaic approach to doing business cases for major projects. There's a very set sort of form of analysis that needs to go into it, starting with the long list. You then measure that long list against critical success factors. So you start off with a SWOT analysis, and then you factor in the environmental analysis that we saw a sort of brief summary of earlier. And there's a very formulaic approach to it, which is all documented in the outline business case. But for anyone interested, you can find the HM Treasury Green Book guidance online, which explains exactly how all of the options have to be benchmarked against each other.
Thank you, Mr. Story. Mr. Bush, final question, please.
Gentlemen, not questioning your intelligence. I guess you guys got years of experience. Our forefathers in these islands chose this location because of their experience, 1932 hurricanes and etc. There's no reason currently today why we need to keep cargo on that dock at all. No reason. We have hundreds of acres of land in East End, Boddentown, and West Bay. There's no reason to put all the cargo in CDC. There's no reason for the whole island to go to CDC to get their cargo. This is my point. We are suffocating ourselves when we don't need to do it. We don't need to build a port, technically. That's my point.
Thank you very much for your comment, Mr. Bush. Of course, we'd like to thank everyone for participating tonight and for all of your insightful questions. Yes. As you heard throughout this evening, the hosting of the public meetings is actually part of government's ongoing commitment to transparency and ensuring that you, the residents within our communities, have the opportunity to voice your opinions on the development of major infrastructure projects. Of course, your feedback, we've been saying that all evening, is very, very important. There's another meeting that is taking place tomorrow on the cargo port development. It's going to happen at the Church of God Chapel on Shamrock Road in in Bodden Town. We're going to ask our minister to now come up with final remarks. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to say thank you so much for coming out. We heard a lot of feedback from you, some good, strong questions, which will help us filter this process, and for the government and for the specialists who have been procured to give the best advice. No question has not been considered, and I hope that it could be shown in the report that your points have been factored. I encourage you, please, let everybody know about the meeting tomorrow. It is in Bodden Town, but that doesn't mean that you can't come back again. You may think about something tonight and bring it back up, because I really want as much consultation as possible. So come on again tomorrow. Call your friends, call your family members, call those in the eastern districts, and let them come out. As you can tell, the people who got most of the attention tonight were those who were present to ask those questions. So I encourage you, thank you so much for coming tonight. I appreciate that, and I'll see you all tomorrow evening. God bless you, and good night.
Just two quick reminders before you go. There's some refreshments at the back of the room. Please help yourself. The second thing is the questions that were not addressed on Slido will all be compiled as part of the documentation for any recommendations and feedback that you've provided. Be safe on the road, everybody. Good night.